Here we go. All right. Well, as a lot of you might be aware of, actually, just this week, the public deliberation of Slovenia's national coal phase-out strategy began. And Slovenia actually aims to adopt a decision on the timeline of coal phase-out in the next few months. The three scenarios that are currently proposed, or the three timelines that are currently proposed, are 2033, 2038, 2042. And actually a working group composed of members or representatives of different ministries in Slovenia proposed the 2033 as the most optimum date based on environmental economic factors. So we are actually very excited. The timing of this conference is quite perfect, and we're very happy to have with us today 4 guests with whom we will be discussing the topic of coal phase out. We will be discussing everything from what do the goals of the Paris Agreement mean for coal production globally and in countries like Slovenia. We will look into the energy plans of the EU countries for the next decade and seeing how the EU power sector will look like in 10 years' time. And then we will also take a look at the business side of things. And we have representatives from 2 energy utilities with us today that have one of the most ambitious coal phase-out plans. And hopefully we'll get to hear a bit more about the economic rationale behind the move away from coal. In terms of the structure, as you've seen in the program, we will have 2 back-to-back presentations followed by a Q&A session. Then we will go into a break, come back for another 2 presentations and a Q&A session. And yeah, I won't take any more of our time, and I will now just give a quick introduction and invite our first speaker to take the floor. We have with us Gaurav Ganti from Climate Analytics. Gaurav is a mechanical engineer who has specialized in renewable systems design and currently works as policy analyst for climate analytics. Climate analytics aims to provide science and policy analysis in the field of climate change and aims to support with that analysis sort of science-based policy decisions globally. And today he will talk to us about global and regional coal phase-out requirements of the Paris Agreement. So, welcome, Gaurav.
Thank you, Katya. I'm going to try to share my screen. A theme you might have heard multiple times over Zoom over the past year. So, is my presentation visible?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So yeah, again, I would like to start by reiterating a thank you to Katya and Greenpeace Slovenia for the kind invitation to present today. The theme of my presentation is assessing the global and regional coal phase-out requirements required to align country-level action with the goals of the Paris Agreement. And I hope that this will provide a frame through which you can assess the other contributions or the other presentations today. And I'm also really looking forward to them. So to do this, I've essentially structured this presentation in 3 parts. So in the first part, I'll provide a little bit of background on the Paris Agreement, the long-term temperature goal, and where we stand currently with respect to what countries have promised to do. I will then walk you through the implications for coal globally using the assessment provided by the IPCC Special Report on 1.5 degrees as a starting point. And then I will finally conclude with some messages for what this means for the OECD and the European Union and why these phase-out benchmarks matter. So the first part, which I think is important to look at, is what the Paris Agreement says. So Article 2 of the Paris Agreement essentially establishes the long-term temperature goal, essentially with countries committing to keep warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius And Article 4 essentially establishes the basis for countries now setting net zero targets. And all of you must have seen a whole number of net zero targets coming out recently. The reason behind the setting of these goals was that there is a significant difference in impact between 1.5 degrees of warming and 2 degrees of warming. To put this in context, the 2 degrees goal was the previous goal agreed in Cancun. And this was then, the ambition was increased for Paris. And this was in light of new scientific evidence that the worst impacts of climate change could still be avoided, keeping 1.5 as the guardrail and not 2 degrees. So it is in this context of an updated target that we then have the question, how do we achieve this? Or what are the emission reduction pathways and energy transition options that we need to undertake to achieve this goal? Unfortunately, and this is related to another project which we engage in, under current policies, we're on track for an even chance of nearly 2.9 or nearly 3 degrees of warming by the end of century. And even if we assess that countries will achieve what they have pledged to do or the targets that they've set themselves, this still sets us at 2.6 degrees of warming. So this is just to put things in perspective and to say that even what countries promise, so what countries are currently on track to achieve is far away from what they have promised they will achieve. And even what they promise they will achieve in the short term is quite insufficient to meet the temperature goal. So it is in this context that we're going to discuss these coal phase out benchmarks, because phasing out coal from the power sector is one of the key short-term interventions which will keep the window open to achieving the Paris Agreement's goals. And the reason for that is multifaceted. One of the reasons is coal in the power sector can be considered to be a somewhat low-hanging fruit of decarbonization, because there are many alternatives which are available, which are cost-effective and ready to deploy. And so this discussion on a coal phase-out and its associated benefits in terms of emissions presents one of the key short-term low-hanging fruits that we can, as a global community, use to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. So keeping this in mind, I'm now going to jump into what the Paris Agreement means for coal globally. And essentially the starting point for this assessment is going to be the special report on 1.5 that the IPCC produced in 2018. And this essentially established a trajectory for emissions, or a trajectory for emissions that would give us a chance of meeting the Paris Agreement. So the first key insight, and so in this graph, the dotted lines and the hashed lines represent CO2 and greenhouse gas emissions respectively. And what you see is that essentially both CO2 and greenhouse gas emissions in these pathways, which were assessed by the IPCC, peak around 2020, decline rapidly to at least 45% below 2010 levels by 2030, with CO2 emissions reaching net zero around 2050 and greenhouse gas emissions reaching net zero around 2070. And these pathways, or the pathways which are underlying this assessment, then provide the starting basis for us to then try to unpack what this means for coal in the electricity sector. So essentially what we did as a starting point was pull out the pathways which were assessed by the IPCC that would result in the achievement of the goals laid out by the Paris Agreement. So essentially, among nearly 400 pathways generated by integrated assessment models, you essentially have around 53 pathways that could be assessed to be consistent with Article 2 of the Paris Agreement. So now I'll give you a little bit of insight into what these 53 pathways do. So these 53 pathways would have at least an even chance, so at least a 50% chance of achieving the long-term temperature goal of the Paris Agreement at the end of century. But they would also have a low overshoot, which means that for a certain period of time over the course of the century, warming would exceed 1.5 degrees and then would be reduced to 1.5 degrees through the use of carbon dioxide removal technologies. What we then further did was apply a set of sustainability criteria. So the reason we apply these criteria is because different models use different amounts of carbon dioxide removal technologies, and many of them show quite a heavy reliance on these technologies. So what we do is we used a study by some researchers, which was also cited in the SR15, essentially as the basis to further down select these 53 pathways by applying a constraint on how much carbon sequestration happens through bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, and to limit the amount of land sequestration which is envisaged by these models. So essentially applying these constraints leaves us with 19 pathways from which we could derive some insights on what this means for coal power. And all these pathways show some pretty consistent messages for coal in the power sector. So the first key insight which we get is that coal in the power sector essentially peaks by 2020. It rapidly declines to 80% below 2010 levels by 2030, and it is phased out by 2040 at the latest. So in this figure, you'll observe that we essentially define the phase out date, not with the absolute zero, which is seen in these models, but we essentially assess that if generation is falling 10% below 2010 levels, then that is effectively the point at which coal is phased out. And this is in some way to try to match what we observe in reality with what we get as modeled estimates. So the assumption here is that if coal generation falls below 10% of 2010 levels, it's clear that they're unprofitable and no one would keep a coal power plant running at really, really low levels because that's simply unprofitable. A second key insight, which is particularly important, is that this rapid coal phase out is not just an artifact of the 1.5 warming limit of the Paris Agreement, but is also something which we see in 2-degree compatible pathways, which were also assessed by the IPCC. So you do see that the rate of decline varies a little bit, and that the phase out threshold would be reached a few years later. But in terms of effective characteristics of these pathways, the message around coal is remarkably consistent. Despite this remarkable consistency in the message on what is needed for coal, unfortunately, the current world planned capacity and existing capacity, if operated to its existing lifetime, would essentially lead to a large and growing gap to what is needed. And there are 2 key insights which you get from this figure. The first one is that no new capacity essentially can be installed or operated till its lifetime if we want to have any chance of achieving the Paris Agreement through a cost-effective strategy. But the second key insight is even those power plants which are already in operation cannot be operated to the end of their lifetime, but essentially need to be in a strong managed decline if we're going to utilize what I called this low-hanging fruit for decarbonization. Now, you might ask the question, well, what happens if we don't phase out coal? Does this mean that any climate goals are out of reach? That's not true. What it means is that you either have to do more costly abatement somewhere else. So you have to pick other options which are not necessarily low-hanging. So that is displacement across sectors, or you have a certain displacement effect across countries where if certain countries don't phase out their coal by a certain deadline, it either puts pressure on sectors within that country to decarbonize faster, or it puts pressure on other countries to decarbonize their coal sectors faster and can be potentially assessed in terms of whether they're making a fair and sufficient contribution to meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement. However, we also see that regionally there is quite some difference in the structures of the coal fleets, right? So there are some regions which are planning to expand or enter into coal, and there are some which are contracting their coal pipelines or reducing the number of coal power plants that they have. And what we do observe in many developing countries is that their plant capacity has been collapsing over the course of the last few years, largely in response to the fact that coal is simply uneconomic. So you now get two types of messages. The first message is that OECD countries, which are, as you can see in this map, in a stage of structural decline of coal, need to accelerate the pace of this decline so that they can take the lead in phasing out coal and demonstrating the viability of low carbon alternatives. And for developing countries, you would try to avoid locking in new infrastructure that would essentially face a high risk of being stranded. The good news is that the cost of alternatives has been dropping quite rapidly over the past decade, with many low carbon alternatives essentially more economic than even existing coal power plants in many markets. So to this end, it essentially becomes a question of the will to set up a strong coal phase out plan and to enable low carbon alternatives to enter your system, and is less a question of whether there are potential possible alternatives. So now in the last parts of my slide, I will walk you through the regional coal phase out benchmarks, what this means for the European Union, and some work which we had done, which included some of the Slovenian power plants for an analysis we did for the EU. The first part, which I think is important to note, is that the regional benchmarks, as I had already alluded to, vary, with the OECD essentially taking the lead in phasing out coal. But while you might see some variance in this picture, the essential messaging remains the same, which is that the general need to phase out coal is very stringent, and that while the phase out benchmark dates might vary a bit, it's more about signaling a leadership or the desire to take leadership in phasing out coal that is important. An example of where this has not happened, or what we saw recently not happening, was for Germany's proposed coal exit law, where they decided to phase out coal by 2038. But it wasn't only the phase out date that was an issue, it was also the way the coal exit law was structured. So the way it was structured, and you can see this a bit in this figure, was essentially to allow lignite power plants to operate for much longer, but also to ensure that these power plants would essentially operate right until the end dates which were specified. So there was not a pathway of structured decline over time, which points to two different elements which are important. So the first element which is important is when you shut down your coal power plants. But the second key insight is what your rate of reduction looks like. So are you operating coal power plants right until a deadline and then shutting them all down? Or are you planning a managed staggered phase out? And the German case is an example of a design where they operate right until they have to shut down, or they're forecasted to operate right until they shut down. And this is a second element which is good to keep in mind while assessing these phase out benchmarks. The reason being that in a previous figure, I'd shown you that it's not just the global 2040 benchmark which matters, it's the 80% reduction which happens in the decade preceding it that puts you on a pathway for that phase out benchmark to be realized. And in any discussions about coal phase out benchmarks, it's important to keep this trajectory of reduction in mind while assessing it. So in my last slide, I will walk you through some work which we had done in 2016. What we had done then, and this work preceded the release of the special report on 1.5, we essentially assessed a single pathway which phased out coal in the EU by 2030. And then we tried to come up with a potential retirement schedule in the EU as a whole. So this was to say, we have a number of units in the EU. What are different strategies to essentially shut down these units? And we essentially had two perspectives in that report. So the first perspective essentially took the perspective of a regulator who has an environment integrity perspective, so shutting down the most emission intensive units. And the second perspective was a market perspective, which is to minimize the total cost of such a phase out. And what we did in that thought exercise, so to speak, was essentially take all the power plants in the EU and figure out what a phase out schedule could look like. And what we did find for the Slovenian power plants is essentially a phase out in the 2025 to 2030 timeframe. You will note that there are probably more power plants in our 2016 study than there are currently under discussion, but should already, I think, provide some food for thought in the timeframes which we came up with, which were consistent with these 2030 benchmarks when viewed from an overall EU perspective. So finally, in conclusion, I think it's important to keep in mind the global coal phase-out benchmark date of 2040 to understand its interpretation, which is that it's a low-hanging fruit for decarbonization, and not committing to a coal phase-out in line with these benchmarks either means that you have to decarbonize other sectors faster, or you are relying on other countries to carry the weight. The other key message is that cost-effective alternatives have existed for a while right now. And the final one was that it doesn't matter just when you set your benchmark, but you need to set a managed decline, which sees those reductions happening in a manner that is consistent with the rate of decline needed globally up to 2030. So recognizing that I still have 10 minutes, I suppose that I could ask for questions if there are any.
Yes, I was just writing in the chat that if you do have any questions for Gaurav and the topic of his presentation, please write it down in the chat. Yeah, now we have about 10 minutes that we can devote and kind of not wait for the Q&A session, but we can also address any questions later on in the Q&A session. But yeah, if anybody has anything that they would really be interested in now, please, you can also just raise your hand and we can invite you.
Maybe the second last slide, if you could go through the numbers. So where is Slovenia right now? I mean, I guess this would be the next topic, but still, if you have them already.
So I think it was, those numbers were just food for thought, but they're essentially from a 2016 report we did. So I would focus a little less on the absolute numbers we came up there, but it was more to show the timeframes in which we had assessed this in 2016. So I think that the next presentations would be a bit more accurate with the current status of the climate and energy plans, and might have a better insight there. So I would defer.
Okay.
I see now that questions are actually popping up, and I would, because I know that like a lot of that questions that are now coming up would be actually interesting also to address while we also hear Charles' presentation. So, but if any of, because I know that Daniel and Borut have posed a question, and if any of them are not able to be in the Q&A session, I would say let's address their question now. But if you're able to be, Borut and Daniel, in the Q&A session, I would move to the second presentation and then have a discussion, because it might be relevant and yeah, because it kind of overlaps. Okay, yeah, they have no problem with that. Thank you. So I will mark those two questions, and Gaurav will also stay with us the next hour or so. So he can also pitch in then. But yeah, okay, there's questions coming, but maybe we can move ahead to the second presentation and come back. So thank you, Gaurav. This was indeed very interesting, and also it set, as you said, like a good frame for our continued discussions. And